So what we're going to concentrate on now is highlights, shadows, and then also filling in some of the empty space between some of these blocked in trees in the back. So we're going to try to like do multiple things with the simplest amount of brush strokes. So what you can do to give the trees some depth and some form is you can add either highlights or shadows. It depends on how dark you made the blocked in trees. Like if the trees are really dark when they're blocked in, you may want to add highlights. If the trees are really light when you block them in, then you may want to add some shadows. So, and then also adding one of those things is going to help fill in a lot of the gaps. So I'll show you what I mean by this on these dark evergreen trees here. So what I'm going to do is mix up a color that is similar to that but lighter. So I'm going to mix up a green and I'm going to add some white to it to create some highlights. And then I'm using a very small brush to do this. And then the key with making trees look like they're three-dimensional is to alternate the darks and the lights. This tree here, I can tap in some lighter color, and then I'm gonna skip a little bit and I'm gonna tap in some lighter color just below that. And then I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna skip the next little bit. I'm gonna tap in the lighter color like that. And what I'm doing is creating the sense that there's some branches that are catching light and then are dark on the underside of the branch where the light isn't catching. And at the same time, simultaneously, I'm actually filling in some of the empty negative space of the sky that's kind of showing through there. So then I get a little bit of form on that tree. All right, I'm going to show you the opposite now on a lighter tree where I made the tree very light. So this time I'm going to mix up a green, but I'm going to add a little black to it. You can use blue or black, either one. All right, and obviously if your tree is like orange, then you want to mix up a dark orange. If your tree is brown, you want to make a darker brown. All right, remember each tree has its own little color palette, right? Each tree has its own individual color scheme and color palette. You can see there's a lot of gaps there. So now I'm going to use the darker color and I'm going to tap in some shadow tones. And I'm going to use this same effect of skipping down and alternating so that I get an alternation between dark areas and light areas. And that helps give the illusion that the tree has that three-dimensional form. Something like that. And then I've also filled in some of those empty gaps like I was talking about. So the first thing I'm going to do is this line of trees actually has a shadow underneath it. So I'm going to do that. You don't have, this is optional, but what I'm going to do is mix up a shadow color, and I'm going to add a little bit of water to make the paint a little bit lighter and a little bit more transparent. And then I'm just going to use a brush. So this paint's pretty thin, and I'm just going to add, well, it needs to be thinner. I want to create almost like a watercolor wash across the bottom to create a shadow. And one thing about this paint also is that it dries lighter than when you put it on there. So sometimes you add a color and it looks too dark, and then as soon as the water evaporates, it'll lighten up. So that's something that takes a little bit of time to understand once you've worked with the paint. So that shadow that's under the trees, that should lighten up a little bit once the water dries. All right, so then middle ground tree. So in this photo, the middle ground tree is sort of this is an odd middle ground tree in this photo because it was planted long after the trees in the background grew into full maturity. So this one's really small. I'm going to make a middle ground tree that's slightly larger just to kind of emphasize that concept of things getting larger as they move closer to the viewer. The nice thing about creating these landscapes is that you can really do whatever you want. You can move things around, you can make things larger or smaller, as long as you sort of stick to the general rules of reality. So, and then the other thing I can pick here is I can pick where I want to put this middle ground tree, maybe based on contrast, so that I can see the middle ground tree clearly against the background trees. So I'm not going to put it here because I have a light tree there. So I'm going to put it over on this side. So I'm just going to start to build the tree. And now the tree is going to get a lot more detail. So I'm going to start to create a bigger tree, slightly bigger tree, not huge, because I don't want to make it look like it's in the foreground. Okay, and then I'm going to use a shadow color. So I'm going to take a darker tone and then start to define the underneath parts. All right, same idea as we did before, where you're kind of alternating. You don't want to create like stripes necessarily, but you want to alternate dark areas and light areas to show that some branches are catching light and some branches are in shadow. Or, well, it's more like the tops of the branches catch the light and the bottoms of the branches are in shadow. Like that. What color do you think of the trunk of a tree being? Okay, typically, yes, we think about a tree being like brown, but oftentimes it's actually a bit more of a grayish or a purplish. If you look carefully at tree trunks, they're not like, they're not brown, they're not like a balanced brown. They're usually a little bit more whitish or purplish. So you can create a brown, but I wouldn't do like a very bright brown. Stay away from a very reddish brown. Okay, you want to make it much more cooler. So I'm going to add a little bit of white and a little bit of turquoise to my brown that I made to create more of a tree trunk color. You can actually see in the photo in the tree in the foreground, you can see that it's kind of a purplish gray. All right, so now this middle ground tree needs a trunk. So I'm going to make the trunk, remember, with deciduous trees, which are the leafy trees. Most of the tree is the crown typically. Okay, unless the trees are very, very, very tall. When trees are young, the trunk only takes up like really the bottom part, just a little bit like that. And if you want to, you can add a few little spots where maybe the branches are starting to peek out of the tree a little bit. All right, so you can start to think about, as the trees get closer, you can start to see the structure of them a little bit more. Yeah, purple, white, and then add a little bit of yellow to neutralize it. Okay?